It was just an exhausted father with a rusty torque wrench standing between three aggressive thugs and a cornered woman. But when a fleet of blacked-out SUVs suddenly swarmed the alley, freezing the Chicago block in dead silence, those boys realized the helpless woman they were harassing owned the very concrete beneath their feet. The bitter Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons of the West Loop, carrying with it the icy bite of late November. Arthur Pendleton pulled the collar of his worn canvas jacket tighter around his neck, burying his chin into the frayed fabric. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and deep exhaustion. At 34, the harsh lines around his eyes made him look a decade older, etched by 12-hour shifts at Donovan's Auto Repair and the relentless, suffocating pressure of single fatherhood. In his calloused, grease-stained right hand, he gripped the straps of a faded canvas duffel bag. Inside rested his heavy tools and a small, brightly colored plush rabbit that had cost him exactly $12.50 at a corner pharmacy. It was a modest peace offering for his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, who was waiting back at their cramped South Side apartment with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. Chloe's asthma had flared up again that week, and the mounting medical bills felt like a physical weight pressing down on Arthur's chest. Every step he took toward the train station was fueled purely by the desperate need to see his daughter smile. To shave 10 minutes off his walk to the L train, Arthur took a detour down an industrial service alley sandwiched between two towering, newly renovated commercial buildings. The alley was poorly lit, the flickering amber glow of a single sodium street lamp barely piercing the gloom. The damp asphalt smelled of rotting cardboard and stale rain. Halfway down the narrow passage, Arthur's boots ground to a halt. The sound of overlapping, aggressive male voices echoed off the brick walls, cutting through the low hum of the distant city traffic. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be like that. We're just trying to show you a good time," a slurred, arrogant voice sneered. "I told you to step aside," a woman's voice replied. It was remarkably steady, lacking the tremor of panic one might expect, though the underlying tension was palpable. "You are making a mistake." "The only mistake is you walking out here all by your lonesome," a second male voice chimed in, accompanied by the hollow thud of a fist hitting a brick wall, blocking her path. "What's in the bag? You got a number we can call? Maybe an address we can drop you at?" Arthur stepped into the dim pool of light and assessed the scene. 3 young men in their early 20s had formed a tight, intimidating semicircle around a woman. They wore expensive, down-filled puffer jackets and pristine sneakers, the uniform of affluent college kids with too much liquid courage and zero real-world consequences. They were practically vibrating with predatory, drunken energy. The woman they had cornered was backed against a locked steel delivery door. She was dressed inconspicuously in an oversized beige trench coat that reached her calves, a thick wool scarf pulled up high around her lower face, and a dark beanie pulled low. She gripped a sleek, unmarked leather briefcase tightly to her chest. To a passerby, she looked like an ordinary, tired office worker caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The survival instinct of a man living paycheck to paycheck screamed at him to keep walking, to mind his own business. A physical altercation could mean police involvement, an arrest, a missed shift, or worse, an injury that would leave him unable to work. If he fell, Chloe would fall with him. There was no safety net, no late wife, Sarah, to catch them anymore, just the cold reality of their bank account. But as the largest of the 3 men, a broad-shouldered kid with a heavy gold chain resting over his dark turtleneck, reached out and roughly grabbed the lapel of the woman's coat, a visceral surge of protective fury ignited in Arthur's gut. He remembered Sarah. He remembered promising her he would always do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. Arthur dropped his canvas duffel bag to the asphalt with a heavy, metallic thud. The sound was loud enough to make all 3 young men snap their heads in his direction. "Hey!" Arthur's voice was low, gravelly, and carried the undeniable authority of a man who had absolutely no patience left in his soul. "Step away from her, right now." The broad-shouldered kid, evidently the alpha of the trio, let go of the woman's coat and turned fully to face Arthur. A mocking grin spread across his flushed face. "Or what, old man? You're going to give us a lecture? Take a hike. This doesn't concern you." "I won't ask twice," Arthur said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply reached down into his unzipped duffel bag. His fingers brushed past the plush rabbit and wrapped around the cold, textured grip of a 24-inch solid steel torque wrench. He pulled it out, letting the heavy steel shaft catch the flickering amber streetlight. He let the head of the wrench rest against his thigh, the sheer weight of it pulling his shoulder down slightly. "Let her walk," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto the leader. "And you three go sleep it off. Nobody needs to bleed tonight." The alley grew incredibly tense. The second kid, a taller, gangly youth, nervously shifted his weight. "Brad, man, look at this psycho. He's got a pipe. Let's just bounce." "Shut up, Tyler," Brad snapped, his ego bruised by the interruption. He reached into his own pocket, pulling out a sleek modern switchblade with a metallic snick, a 3-inch blade locked into place. "You think a mechanic's tool scares me, grease monkey? I'll carve you up before you even swing that thing." Arthur didn't blink. His grip on the wrench tightened, his knuckles turning white. He calculated the distance. 3 steps. If Brad lunged, Arthur would have to aim for the collarbone to drop him quickly before the knife could find flesh. It was a terrible, desperate math. The woman in the trench coat watched Arthur, her sharp blue eyes widening slightly above her scarf. "Sir, please," she said, her voice cutting through the standoff. "Don't risk yourself. They aren't worth your life." Arthur ignored her, his absolute focus fixed on Brad's blade. "Come on then, kid," Arthur whispered, bracing his legs. "Let's see what you've got." Brad snarled and shifted his weight to lunge. Before Brad's front foot could even strike the pavement, the world outside the alley erupted. It didn't begin with sirens, but with a synchronized, mechanical roar that seemed to vibrate through the very asphalt beneath their feet. Twin beams of blinding, high-intensity LED headlights flooded the narrow passage from both ends simultaneously, washing out the amber street lamp and casting stark, elongated shadows against the brickwork. Arthur squinted, instinctively raising his left arm to shield his eyes from the glare. 2 massive, midnight black Maybach S-Class sedans had violently mounted the curbs at either end of the alley, completely sealing off all exits. They didn't idle. They purred with terrifying, expensive power. For a single, suspended second, the street went dead silent. The drunken bravado radiating from Brad, Tyler, and the third boy instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold, sobering realization that they were entirely trapped. The silence shattered as all 8 doors of the Maybachs opened in perfect unison. 6 men stepped out into the freezing air. They were identically dressed in tailored dark suits, black overcoats, and earpieces, moving with a predatory, synchronized efficiency that screamed elite private military, not standard security. Arthur slowly lowered his wrench, utterly bewildered. The lead security detail, a towering man with salt and pepper hair and cold, assessing eyes, walked briskly past Arthur without giving him a second glance. He approached the woman in the trench coat, who had casually lowered her scarf, revealing a sharp, striking face with high cheekbones and an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. "Miss Kensington," the head of security said, his voice crisp and deferential, "I apologize for the delay. The decoy convoy encountered a deliberate blockade on Wacker Drive. Are you harmed?" "I am perfectly fine, Thomas," Victoria Kensington said. The slight tremble that had been in her voice earlier was entirely gone. It had been an act, a calculated stall tactic. Victoria Kensington, the billionaire CEO of Kensington Global Financial, a woman whose mere signature could shift the economies of small nations, stepped forward. She pulled the dark beanie from her head, letting a cascade of immaculate blonde hair fall over the shoulders of her cheap disguise. She had walked this route specifically to slip out of a highly sensitive, covert corporate merger meeting unseen by the press. Brad's switchblade clattered onto the pavement. His hands were shaking violently. Tyler looked like he was about to vomit. The third boy was completely frozen, his eyes darting between the armed men surrounding them. They suddenly understood that they hadn't cornered a helpless secretary. They had walked into a steel trap with a titan. "You 3, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a glacial, authoritative register that echoed off the brick walls. "You thought you found a victim tonight." She walked slowly toward Brad, who practically shrank into his oversized jacket. Thomas shadowed her flawlessly, his hand resting casually near the lapel of his coat. "What is your name?" Victoria demanded, her blue eyes piercing Brad. Be Brad, he stammered, all his former arrogance shattered. Bradley Hastings. Look, lady, we were just joking around. We didn't know who. Thomas. Victoria interrupted seamlessly, not breaking eye contact with Brad. Hastings. Run it. Thomas tapped his earpiece, murmuring into his lapel microphone. Less than 10 seconds later, he spoke. Bradley Hastings. Junior at Northwestern. Father is Richard Hastings, Regional Vice President at Vanguard Logistics. Vanguard currently relies on a $200 million line of credit from Kensington Global. Brad's knees literally buckled, though he managed to stay upright by leaning heavily against the brick wall. He knew exactly what that meant. His father's career, his family's wealth, his entire privileged existence was currently resting in the palm of the woman he had just threatened. Listen to me very carefully, Bradley, Victoria said softly, stepping within inches of his trembling face. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you are going to call your father. You are going to tell him exactly what you and your friends tried to do to a woman in an alley tonight. If I do not receive a written apology from him by noon, indicating that you have been pulled from your university and placed into a rigorous rehabilitation program, I will personally dissolve his division at Vanguard by Friday. Do you understand me? Yes, Brad choked out, tears of genuine terror welling in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Please. Get out of my sight, she commanded. All of you. Leave the knife. The security team parted just enough to let the three young men sprint out of the alley, tripping over their own feet in their desperation to escape the headlights. The alley was once again filled only with the low purr of the Maybach engines. Victoria let out a long, weary sigh, the corporate mask dropping slightly as she pinched the bridge of her nose. She turned around to face the man who had stood between her and a blade. But Arthur was already gone. While Victoria had been delivering her crushing verdict, Arthur had quietly slipped his torque wrench back into his canvas duffel bag. He didn't care about billionaires, corporate mergers, or dramatic retribution. He only cared that his watch read 9:15 p.m. Mrs. Higgins, charged by the hour, and Chloe needed her breathing treatment. He had backed away into the shadows of the adjacent street, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of engine grease and the echoing memory of a man who was willing to lose everything to do the right thing. Victoria stared at the empty space where the tired mechanic had stood. She noticed a tiny, bright pink fabric tag lying on the damp asphalt where his bag had been dropped. Thomas stepped forward, retrieving it and handing it to her. It was a ripped cardboard tag from a cheap plush toy. On the back, written in smeared blue ink, were the words, "To Chloe. Love, Dad." Victoria stared at the tag, her perfectly manicured thumb tracing the letters. For the first time in her rigidly controlled life, the billionaire CEO felt a profound, undeniable sense of debt. "Thomas," Victoria said, her voice quiet but carrying a dangerous new edge. "Find him. I don't care what it takes. Find out who he is." The rattling of the L train window against Arthur Pendleton's temple was the only thing keeping him awake on the commute south to Pilsen. The adrenaline from the alleyway had burned off long ago, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. He didn't think about the woman in the trench coat or the fleet of black cars. To a man drowning in medical debt, billionaires and their bodyguards were just characters in a movie playing on a television he couldn't afford to buy. He trudged up the 3 flights of slanted, creaking stairs to apartment 3B. The hallway smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and old floor wax. Arthur fumbled with his keys, quietly unlocking the deadbolt so as not to wake his neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. "Arthur, is that you?" A raspy whisper called out from the tiny kitchen. Mrs. Higgins, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher with a heart of gold and a crippling arthritis problem, was sitting at the chipped Formica table. She was nursing a mug of lukewarm tea. "I'm sorry I'm late, Betty," Arthur said, shedding his heavy canvas coat and hanging it on a broken peg. He pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his jeans and slid it across the table. Trains were delayed. Mrs. Higgins pushed the bill back toward him with a knobby, defiant finger. "Keep it, Arthur. Use it for the heating bill. It's supposed to drop to 5 degrees tomorrow." "Betty," we agreed. "I said keep it," she insisted gently, standing up with a wince. She had a rough evening. Her breathing was shallow around 7. I gave her the nebulizer treatment like you showed me. She's asleep now. Arthur's chest tightened. A familiar, terrifying vice grip that squeezed his heart every time his daughter's lungs betrayed her. He thanked Betty, locked the door behind her, and crept into the single bedroom he shared with his 7-year-old. Chloe was curled into a small ball beneath a faded patchwork quilt, her chest rising and falling with a faint, rattling wheeze. The room smelled heavily of eucalyptus and albuterol. Arthur knelt beside her bed, his grease-stained fingers gently brushing a damp lock of brown hair from her forehead. He reached into his duffel bag, retrieved the bright pink plush rabbit, missing its tag, and tucked it under her arm. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb, staring at a stack of final notices from Rush University Medical Center. $84,000. It was the crushing remainder of his late wife Sarah's oncology bills, compounded by the astronomical costs of Chloe's specialized pulmonary care. He was a master mechanic, pulling in $25 an hour. The math wasn't just depressing, it was a death sentence. Meanwhile, 40 floors above the glittering expanse of downtown Chicago, the world operated on entirely different math. Victoria Kensington stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, staring out at the grid of city lights. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman forged in corporate steel. At 36, she had ruthlessly expanded Kensington Global Financial into a multi-billion-dollar empire, navigating boardrooms filled with sharks who smiled while holding knives to her back. She was accustomed to transactions, leverage, and calculated loyalty. She was not accustomed to someone stepping in front of a blade for her without knowing her net worth. The heavy oak doors of her office opened quietly. Thomas, her head of security, stepped in holding a slim, gray folder. "Did you find him?" Victoria asked, not turning around. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, stepping up to her desk. "It took cross-referencing transit cameras near the alley with uniform supply registries. His name is Arthur Pendleton, 34 years old. He works as a senior technician at William Donovan's Auto Repair on Halsted Street." Victoria turned, her sharp blue eyes locking onto the folder. "Give me the rest." "He's a widower," Thomas continued, his usually stoic voice softening a fraction. "His wife, Sarah Pendleton, passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years ago. He is the sole provider for his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. She suffers from severe, chronic asthma that requires frequent hospitalization." Thomas opened the folder, spreading out a few printed pages. Financially, he is underwater. He carries over $80,000 in medical debt, no criminal record, outstanding credit until his wife's illness. He works 50 to 60 hours a week, and from what we can gather, he lives entirely off the grid of social media or public presence. Victoria stared at a grainy security photograph of Arthur leaving the L train station, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his canvas bag. "He had nothing," Victoria murmured, a strange tightness forming in her throat. "He has a sick child, crippling debt, and everything to lose. And yet, he dropped his bag and stood between me and 3 armed, entitled sociopaths." "He thought you were a secretary, Miss Kensington," Thomas noted. "He didn't know he was protecting an asset." "He wasn't protecting an asset, Thomas," Victoria corrected sharply. "He was protecting a human being. In my world, loyalty costs a premium, and it always has an expiration date. That man out there, he operates on a currency I haven't seen in a very long time." She walked back to her desk and picked up her phone. "Clear my morning schedule. Push the Vanguard Logistics Acquisition meeting to 2 o'clock, and have the driver bring the car around. We are taking a trip to Halsted Street." Donovan's Auto Repair was a cavernous, echoing cinderblock structure that smelled permanently of burning rubber, synthetic oil, and industrial degreaser. Sparks flew from a welding torch in the corner, and the deafening whine of a pneumatic impact wrench drowned out the classic rock playing from a dust-covered radio. When the sleek, armor-plated Maybach pulled into the cracked concrete lot, every mechanic in the bays stopped what they were doing. Arthur was currently lying on his back on a plastic creeper, wrestling with a seized transmission on a battered 2014 Ford F-150. Sweat stung his eyes, and his hands were coated to the wrists in black sludge. "Hey, Artie, Bill Donovan, the shop owner," called out nervously, kicking Arthur's boot. "You got, visitors, suit types." Arthur wiped his forehead with the back of his forearm and pushed himself out from under the truck. He stood up, grabbing a red shop rag from his back pocket to wipe the worst of the grease from his hands. Standing in the center of the grimy bay, Looking entirely out of place yet completely unfazed by the dirt and noise was Victoria Kensington. She was wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit and a camel-colored overcoat. Thomas stood 2 paces behind her, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter. Arthur recognized her immediately, even without the oversized trench coat and beanie. He frowned, his muscles tensing. His instinct wasn't relief, it was defensive suspicion. When people with cars that cost more than a house showed up at a place like Donovan's, it usually meant trouble. "Mr. Pendleton," Victoria said, stepping forward. She didn't extend her hand, noticing the heavy layer of oil on his. "I am Victoria Kensington. I figured you were someone important when the private army showed up last night," Arthur said flatly, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "Look, lady, I'm glad you're okay, but I'm on the clock. If you're here to give me a medal or a check, you can keep it. I didn't do it for a reward." Victoria's lips curved into a very faint, genuine smile. "I know you didn't, which is exactly why I am here." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" "Because the corporate world is infested with parasites, Mr. Pendleton," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. "Last night, you met Bradley Hastings. His father, Richard Hastings, was the regional vice president of a company called Vanguard Logistics. Was, Arthur caught the past tense. "I acquired Vanguard this morning," Victoria stated smoothly, "and I terminated Richard Hastings 20 minutes ago. As it turns out, a man who raises a son to pull a knife on a woman in an alley is also the kind of man who embezzles millions from corporate transport budgets." Arthur crossed his arms over his chest. "Fascinating. But I fix transmissions. I don't care about corporate takeovers." "You should," Victoria countered, taking a step closer, completely ignoring the grime on the floor, because part of the Vanguard restructuring involves launching a massive, subsidized medical transport fleet for lower-income families in the greater Chicago area. It requires retrofitting over 200 passenger vans with wheelchair lifts, oxygen support, and specialized equipment. She paused, locking her piercing blue eyes onto Arthur's tired brown ones. "I need a director of fleet operations," Victoria said. "I need someone who actually understands the machines, someone who knows the reality of these streets, and above all, someone who possesses unflinching, incorruptible integrity. I have a building full of Ivy League executives who lie to my face every single day. I need a man who will stand down a blade for a stranger." Arthur stared at her, genuinely stunned. He looked around the garage, at the rusted tools and the oil-stained floors that had defined his life for a decade. "You want me to run a fleet? Lady, I'm a grease monkey. I don't have a degree. I don't wear suits. I have plenty of people who can wear suits and run spreadsheets," Victoria replied sharply. "I need someone to keep the suits from stealing from the mechanics. The starting salary is $150,000 a year." Arthur swallowed hard. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life, but pride, stubborn and deeply ingrained, flared in his chest. "I told you, I don't want a handout. I earn my keep." Victoria's expression softened, the ruthless CEO giving way to something surprisingly empathetic. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Arthur could hear. "It's not a handout, Arthur. It's a transaction. I need your character. You need my resources. And it's not just the salary." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crisp, embossed business card. "Kensington Global's executive healthcare package covers 100% of all dependents' specialized medical care. That includes absolute, unrestricted access to the top pediatric pulmonologists at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. The rusted wrench he had been holding in his left hand clattered onto the concrete floor. Chloe. The crushing weight of $84,000, the terrifying wheeze in the middle of the night, the rationing of inhalers, all of it flashed before his eyes. He looked at Victoria Kensington, realizing for the first time that the woman he had saved in the alley was throwing him a lifeline that would save his daughter's life. Arthur looked down at his grease-stained hands, his jaw tight as he fought back a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. He swallowed the massive lump in his throat. "Where?" Arthur managed to say, his voice thick and rough. "Where is this fleet located?" The Vanguard Logistics Hub in the South Loop was a sprawling, cavernous complex of steel and concrete, large enough to house a commercial airliner. When Arthur Pendleton walked through the massive rolling doors on his first Monday, he didn't wear a suit. He wore a durable pair of dark canvas work pants, steel toe boots, and a heavy, reinforced jacket. He was the new director of fleet operations, but he refused to dress like a man who was afraid of a little dirt. The transition wasn't seamless. The 60 mechanics working on the floor were hardened, cynical veterans who had spent years under the corrupt, corner-cutting regime of Richard Hastings. They expected Arthur to be just another corporate stooge sent down from Kensington Tower to slash budgets and demand impossible quotas. Arthur didn't give a speech. He simply walked over to Bay 4, where 3 technicians were loudly cursing at a stripped engine block on a Ford Transit van, picked up a pneumatic drill, and spent the next 3 hours showing them a bypass technique he had perfected at Donovan's. By lunch, he had their attention. By Friday, he had their absolute loyalty. But Arthur's mechanical intuition quickly uncovered a terrifying reality. In his 3rd week, the first batch of 20 retrofitted medical transport vans rolled off the assembly line. These were the vehicles Victoria Kensington had promised to the city vans, designed to transport children like Chloe to critical pulmonary and oncology appointments. They were supposed to be equipped with state-of-the-art, German-engineered hydraulic wheelchair lifts. Arthur stood at the back of Van 01, holding the official procurement manifest. The invoice, approved directly by Kensington Global's chief financial officer, Harrison Caldwell, listed the lifts at $8,000 apiece. Arthur knelt, running his calloused hand over the steel housing of the hydraulic arm. Something was wrong. The metal felt too light, the welding seams were sloppy, and the manufacturer's stamp looked laser-etched rather than deeply embossed. "Hey, Marcus," Arthur called out to his lead foreman. "Load 300 pounds of dead weight onto this platform." "Sandbags." Marcus frowned but complied, stacking heavy canvas sacks onto the metal grate. Arthur hit the deployment switch. The electric motor whined a high, unnatural pitch that set Arthur's teeth on edge. The lift shuddered, rising halfway before a loud, metallic crack echoed through the bay. The primary shear pins snapped. The platform collapsed, sending the sandbags violently crashing to the concrete floor. Arthur's blood ran cold. If a child in a heavy motorized wheelchair had been on that lift, the fall would have been fatal. He spent the next 12 hours locked in his cramped, windowless office, cross-referencing the serial numbers on the faulty motors with the global shipping manifests he now had access to. The truth he uncovered was a masterclass in corporate rot. Harrison Caldwell wasn't just embezzling funds. He was deliberately purchasing cheap, counterfeit medical equipment from unregulated overseas factories, pocketing millions in the margin difference. But the financial theft was secondary to a much darker motive. If these vans failed publicly, if a disabled child was injured, the resulting catastrophic public relations nightmare would destroy Victoria Kensington's reputation. The board of directors would force her resignation, leaving Caldwell perfectly positioned to execute a hostile takeover of the CEO seat. The rot hadn't just been at Vanguard. It was sitting at the very top of Victoria's empire. Arthur didn't write an email. He didn't schedule a meeting through human resources. He packed the shattered steel shear pin, the counterfeit motor housing, and a thick stack of highlighted manifests into his canvas duffel bag. An hour later, Arthur strode into the towering glass lobby of Kensington Global. The security guards moved to intercept him, but Thomas, the head of security, stepped out from an elevator bank. Thomas took one look at Arthur's grim, thunderous expression and the heavy canvas bag in his hand. "Mr. Pendleton," Thomas said quietly, "are we having an issue?" "I need to see her, Thomas. Right now." Bypassing the board, Thomas nodded once, turning his back on the lobby guards. "Follow me." On the 40th floor, Victoria Kensington was standing at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. The room was filled with senior executives, including Harrison Caldwell, a slick, silver-haired man who was currently presenting a slideshow on the projected success of the new medical fleet. The heavy oak doors swung open. Arthur walked in, his boots sinking into the plush carpeting. The room fell dead silent. "Excuse me," Caldwell snapped, adjusting his silk tie. "Who let this man in? We are in a closed executive session." Arthur ignored him entirely. He walked straight to the center of the mahogany table, unzipped his canvas bag, and pulled out the heavy, sheared steel pin and the cracked motor housing. He dropped them onto the polished wood. The heavy metallic thud echoed through the boardroom, exactly like the wrench he had dropped in the alley weeks ago. "Arthur," Victoria said, her voice calm but her eyes sharp, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. "What is this?" "This," Arthur said, pointing a grease-stained finger at the broken metal, "is what your CFO bought to lift sick kids into your vans. It's a counterfeit. It failed under 300 pounds of weight. If we had deployed these tomorrow, someone would have died." Caldwell's face drained of color, but he quickly masked it with feigned outrage. "This is absurd. I personally vetted those suppliers. This mechanic is clearly out of his depth and attempting to cover up his own team's shoddy installation work." "Shut up!" Arthur growled, his voice carrying the same terrifying, quiet authority he had used on the thugs in the alley. He pulled out the stack of highlighted manifests and slid them across the table to Victoria. "Look at the shell company that holds the patent for these fakes, Miss Kensington. Then look at the holding company that owns Caldwell's summer estate in the Hamptons. They're the same LLC." Victoria picked up the papers. Her eyes scanned the documents with terrifying speed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. When she finally looked up at Harrison Caldwell, her gaze was absolute zero. "Thomas," Victoria said softly, not looking away from the CFO. Thomas stepped into the boardroom, two massive security contractors flanking him. "Miss Kensington, Victoria, please, this is a misunderstanding," Caldwell stammered, standing up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't trust a grease monkey over your own." "You are finished, Harrison," Victoria interrupted, her voice a lethal whisper. "You didn't just steal from me. You gambled with the lives of children to steal my chair. Thomas, escort Mr. Caldwell to the lobby. The federal authorities have already been pinged on his financial discrepancies. Seize his hard drives." As Caldwell was dragged out of the room, sputtering and panicking, the remaining executives sat in terrified silence. Victoria slowly sat down in her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. She looked at the broken metal on her table, then up at Arthur. Once again, this exhausted, uncompromising man had stood between her and a disaster she hadn't seen coming. Meeting adjourned, Victoria announced quietly. The room cleared in record time until only Arthur and Victoria remained. She stood up, walked over to Arthur, and did something she rarely did in the corporate world. She extended her hand. "You saved my life in that alley, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with profound gratitude. "And today, you saved my soul. Thank you." Arthur looked at her hand, wiped his own on his canvas pants, and shook it firmly. "Just doing the job you paid me for, Miss Kensington." 6 months later, the bitter Chicago winter had melted into a bright, blooming spring. Arthur sat on a wrought iron bench in Millennium Park, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He was still wearing his canvas jacket, but the dark circles under his eyes were gone. The crushing weight that had pressed on his chest for 3 years had finally lifted. A few yards away, Chloe was running across the lush green grass, chasing a yellow butterfly. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color. There was no wheezing, no rattling cough. Thanks to the top-tier specialists at Northwestern Memorial, her asthma was entirely under control. Footsteps approached on the concrete path. Victoria Kensington, wearing a casual trench coat and sunglasses, sat down next to him. She handed him a small paper bag from a high-end bakery. "The Vanguard fleet passed its 10,000th safe transport today," Victoria noted, looking out at the park. "The mayor is calling it the most successful private initiative in a decade." "The new hydraulic lifts are holding up perfectly," Arthur replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "German engineering. Real German engineering this time." They sat in comfortable silence, two people from entirely different universes who had forged an unbreakable bond built on mutual respect and absolute integrity. Chloe came running back to the bench, laughing. She stopped, looking at Victoria, and smiled warmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, brightly colored plush rabbit, offering it to the billionaire. "My dad says you're a good friend," the 7-year-old said brightly. Victoria took the rabbit, her throat tightening with unexpected emotion. She looked at Arthur, the single father who had risked everything for a stranger. "Your dad," Victoria whispered to the little girl, "is the best man I know." Arthur Pendleton dropped a wrench to save a stranger, never expecting that single act of courage to rebuild his own life. Victoria Kensington found the rarest commodity in the corporate world, an honest man. Together, they transformed a corrupt empire into a lifeline for thousands. Sometimes, the absolute most powerful force on earth is not extreme wealth or corporate leverage, but the quiet, unyielding weight of a father's true integrity.